This is Erin Cameron. I am doing my final presentation for Media Ethics and Law on media ethics in Scotland. I decided to do my presentation on this because I spent a semester last fall studying at the University of Stirling, which is one of the premier communications and media schools in Scotland, actually in the UK as a whole. They're world-renowned for their Stirling Media and Research Institute, so much of the information I used for this presentation I was able to gather during my time there and through presentations and things like that I was able to see in my classes while I was over there. So the main idea of this presentation has to do with the area of Scotland, not Great Britain as a whole, not the United Kingdom as a whole. Basically because Scotland does have its own unique culture. They do refer to themselves as their own country, although they do fall under the same legislature as England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and they're part of the same continent. This is really important in understanding the geography here, if you're going to understand the discrepancy that they face regarding their media ethics. When studying the history of Scottish journalism and media in Scotland in general, it's really difficult to get a regional view because most historical books and articles cover the history of British journalism. So this is a huge contributor to why there's such a discrepancy between Scottish journalism and the rest of the UK. Even the very first recognized Scottish publication is called the Edinburgh Courant. Edinburgh is one of the main cities in Scotland, and it was the first recognized daily newspaper. This particular picture that I was able to find is actually from just before it became a daily newspaper, so this is Monday to Wednesday, so half the week. But even here you can see that although it was published in Scotland, the main story is taking place in London. So already starting off, there is a bit of a issue regarding the representation of the media. As I said, many historical books and articles that are about journalism in Scotland and Britain as a whole, they do list some of the early Scottish news publications, including the ones I have listed here. However, only the first two papers listed here, the Scotsman and the Courier, are actually published in Scotland. Even though they were published in Scotland, many of the articles took place in London because that's where the Parliament was and that's where the political epicenter is for Great Britain. So even when it did come to reporting on Scottish news, it was only if it was something newsworthy to the entire UK, not only in Scotland itself. This poorly represented the views of the Scottish people from the very beginning. So the question now is, how is this an ethical problem? In my opinion, that media is there to provide citizens with up-to-date information and news that are relevant to their lives and things that they really want to hear and need to know. There's a big issue if publications within a region aren't necessarily publishing things that are pertinent to what's going on there right away, especially through the 19th and 20th centuries and even before that, when there was no other way of finding out news. So there was a huge reliance on print journalism, and it just wasn't representing what they needed to hear as far as what was going on within their region itself. There was a great article written about a year ago by the Herald out of Scotland, and the quote that I particularly like describes that because Britain and not Scotland was their story, and because London, not Glasgow or Edinburgh, was their patch. So basically what this means is that Glasgow and Edinburgh are the main cities within Scotland, and up until the last couple of years, people looking for Scottish news were hearing it out of London. So to give a point of view from the US, that would be like hearing news from San Francisco and Dallas, Texas out of New York. Just doesn't really represent what's going on in the region very accurately, and that's on a global perspective and on a local perspective as well. So this did continue throughout the 20th century. Still today, it does exist sometimes in modern journalism, but I'll talk about in a few minutes how certain events have changed the way that Scottish journalism operates today. Because Scotland is a part of the UK, it's all part of the same legislation. So Scottish journalists follow the same laws and things that they have to follow in the UK. So BBC has all of these published on their website. Their main laws that are important to them consist of defamation, contempt, privacy, copyright. These are things very similar to what we see being the main. Basically, that's just because we're both very developed countries. We have really advanced media programs. We also have higher legislation. So it's not surprising to see those similarities. Something else that is similar to the US is that there are no particular laws regarding political coverage. So some outlets may be more politically polarized towards one party versus another, or more politically polarized towards Scotland than England, so on and so forth. Something that is pretty different between Scotland and the US is the existence of unions. So especially within the last few decades, unions are an essential part of the workforce in Scotland. So these unions help regardless of what you're working in. I'm particularly looking at the National Union of Journalists. So this exists throughout the UK, but there is a Scotland branch. So they do help journalists, protect them from potential lawsuits. They watch out for their pay conditions and their working conditions, make sure that everyone's treated fairly, and they also will provide legal help to journalists that are being mistried or that have gone through some issues within the legal system. So this is different than in the US because even though we have societies and guilds to help journalists and to give them some kind of guidelines as to what the laws are, we don't necessarily help them on a legal level. That would be up to the journalists to find their own lawyer or prosecutor to help them with their case. So in Scotland, as with everywhere else, the digital age has brought citizen journalism to the foreground, but what's different here is that where Scotland misrepresented or underrepresented in the past, citizens now have a voice. So bloggers, student bloggers, and small local online news publications have really been able to take off and become very popular, similar to how they have here in the US. Something that is different though is that print journalism was actually strengthened within the last 10 years or so, along with the rise of the digital age. That's because all of these small local online news outlets actually were talking about the things people wanted to hear in Scotland, so the print publications started covering the right things instead of just everything about the UK. So it no longer seemed like news right out of London. Scotland had its own very clear journalism kind of stance where it never really had before. So now, at the end of the night, you see people leaving work, getting on the trains, everyone's reading a paper as opposed to looking at their phones like they are here. The evening news are done all during the day, so it is current, and someone that wasn't able to look at their phone all day just as easily can read the paper to find out the same info. As some of you may or may not know, in 2014, Scotland was thrown into the media's eye on a global perspective as they entered their referendum. So the referendum is something that happens in Scotland about every 20 years, sometimes 50 years. It's very popular. Basically, it's because many people in Scotland would like to be separate from England. They even would like to be not included in the European Union in some situations. So the referendum really made it obvious that the rest of the world couldn't trust London to hear what Scotland's perspective was on the referendum. So that really threw a lot of Scotland's publications into a global eye because, obviously England is not going to be giving a very clear message from their opponent. During this time, digital media presence, things like that, threw Scotland onto the map. So a lot of different newspapers that people had never heard of before were just blowing up, reading things online and ordering newspapers just to read what was actually going on in Scotland. This just gave Scotland's journalism just a better audience, and also made it respected on a national level. So now the question leads to, why does this matter to ethics and law? So for me, I just felt that it was very unethical that media laws are applying to essentially 4 different countries, despite their very different regions, their different prerogatives, things that were important to them, even their different political views, just weren't being represented the way that they should have been. This really just held back journalism in Scotland, forced writers within Scotland to report on things that were happening hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away in some cases, in London or other places in England. Basically just seeing all of news out of London is basically seeing news out of New York only from the US. So it's not going to be an accurate representation of what's going on everywhere else. It just is amazing that this was considered ethical until the last couple of years, when people really started having ways to go above and beyond to find Scottish journalism and to learn about what was going on in Scotland. Obviously, there are no laws that can help or prevent this because it is all within one legislation, but thankfully the recent availability of media has given Scotland a new lease on life when it comes to their global perception through journalism. In conclusion, I have a little bit of a class discussion just to help further explain the situation in Scotland, and if anyone has any questions, obviously now would be the best time to ask them. Alright, so my first question is, how can this ethical discrepancy compare to the US? I was hoping with this question to hear back from my classmates about maybe how newspapers reported on the Civil War here in the US. When you were reading a newspaper from the Union or from the South, what different perspective you were getting, and if anyone was really able to get the whole picture because they were only seeing one half of the country versus the other. Just thought that would be an interesting thing to start off with. Another question that I think would help familiarize the issue with the rest of the class is to have them imagine an American presidential election, but only out of one. So for chose Dallas, Texas. Just Texas is no Republican state. All news that's coming out of there is pretty much only reporting on the Republican candidates, specifically Trump and Cruz right now. So I just would like the rest of the class to reflect on how they would feel about all of our political, the rest of the world only from Dallas. Like, how would that change the world's perspective on us? And I feel like other people might have other opinions just in general on this particular topic. The third question I have is, how do the poor ethics of circulation of Scottish news relate to the polarized political views of American politics? So once again, in Scotland, we were talking about the differing views between Scotland and England. So in this situation, I'm asking about, say, between the liberal and conservative parties in America. We have different news sources, different news outlets that all have their own political views, and even presidential nominee that they back right now. So I'm just wondering what people think about the ethics of that in comparison to the Scottish situation. My final question is basically just asking, if you were a Scottish reporter, what would you do to combat this? How would you make sure that your story was heard from a Scottish perspective, not British? As a student there, this was something I struggled with, and having a website for a class there, it was really difficult to make sure that the same amount of people read a story in Stirling, where we went to school, than in Cardiff in Wales, or in Belfast in Northern Ireland, or in Manchester in England. You wanted everyone to still have the same takeaway from the story and make sure that it was really news and that it wasn't bent in any way. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation and learned a thing or two about the ethics of media in Scotland. Thanks. Good night.